my last 16 years of my life has been teaming with either Erwin or John. And I find myself incredibly fortunate, not just to be a part of these communities, which are incredible examples of come as you are, but don't stay that way. You can belong whether or not you ever believe. I feel like I've learned so much from them in terms of ministry and leadership. But I want to tell you something a little bit maybe different about these two. Both of them, their most recent book is talking about the masterpiece and the artist. By the way, tonight, The Artist and Soul, make sure you bring this with you. This will get you your book for tonight's event. So come around 7, starts at 7:30, but make sure you keep this, and we'll give you that second book that we promised. But both of them have this ability to communicate the good news of Jesus as if it really is good news. The Artist and Soul and masterpiece, like you can just hear in them their belief in humanity and what God can do. But here's the thing about getting to see these two up close. Their wives love Jesus. Their sons love Jesus. Their daughters love Jesus. Like they've taken their own family and developed leaders in the kingdom. And that to me is incredible. That you see that their faith is so real, it's impacted those closest to them. How many times do we know pastors whose families just derail? Knowing them up close is just such a joy, because not just their message is transformative, but watching how they live their lives has been transformative to me. So I know you're going to enjoy this. Please welcome back John Burke, and welcome with me Erwin McManus.
Hey, good morning. Let's see.
You on? While Erwin's waving his hand over the mic and making it work, man, I so appreciate what you said, Eric. I want to make one caveat on that, is that like all humanity, you can do the exact perfect things, and your sons and daughters can still rebel against God.
Yeah, you know,
and it'll break your heart, but He's still got a plan. And I just thinking that, because I mean, it's true. I love, my son and daughter. I love seeing them walk with Jesus and not hate the church. But I think we all go through times where we're just like, gosh, Lord, this is what you deal with. It's like, oh, it's breaking my heart. I just want them to know you and love you. And
yeah, I appreciate the introduction, but I'm like, yeah. And there isn't a week that goes by that I think to myself, how could I have been a better parent? Or, how could I have kept them from some of the damage of the world around them, most of the Christian damage. And, and I'm just being honest, And so I'm just really grateful that today both my kids are really passionate about Christ.
Yeah.
Not every day. Some days my kids think I've fallen away. So, and, there have been many times they've come to me and said, we need you to step up.
Yeah.
But hi guys, I'm Erwin. We were supposed to do the first session together. I missed my cue. John stepped up. So what do you guys think, John, for I actually was really glad, because I was sitting in the back listening, and gave me a better context for this room and for you guys and for what's going on here.
Why don't you take some time and share a little of your missional story, because you've seen the same kind of fruit of people going from lost to leading in Los Angeles, a very artsy culture and full of all kinds of...
The whole world is artistic.
I know. We are all God's masterpiece.
You wrote a book. I think you should write a book about masterpiece.
Okay. And, all right, I'll do that. I'll call it Artist and Soul.
And I'm gonna make it my mission today just to be an irritant to John.
It was God's providence, because, or when I hung out last night, and after hanging out a little bit more, we know each other crossing, but we're getting to know each other, and I realized you're a contrarian. You're going first, because otherwise your whole talk will be about what I said.
No, it'll be about all the things you did.
But it didn't work.
No. Eric Bryant is our common intersection, over here, he was on staff on our team at Mosaic for how many years? 12 and a half years. He was really my right-hand guy. He was the guy that did all the work people thought I did. And then Eric came here and
now
became
does all
a
the
part
work
of.
people think I do.
Yeah, it gave away. Well, and Eric cannot speak more highly about John's leadership gifts and his heart for evangelism. And I mean, if he only had a job of selling you in Gateway, it would be a good job to have. And he never really talks about my organizational skills. And, yeah. You know, he seems to be always focusing on those particular gifts you have that I seem to be lacking.
Well, he talks about Mosaic all the time.
And,
No, and I think that is why, you know, we wanted to do this, is though we're wired differently, and yet I think God's used us both in similar ways. So talk a little about your story.
Yeah, I think that maybe I'll talk about it from a more personal perspective, because I think one of the great challenges when you are trying to create a community of faith or to lead an endeavor like a church is when you try to do something that is different than who you are. And so you're always using your wrong hand or jumping off your wrong foot. And the great frustration is to admire someone like a John who you think, I want to do it like that, but you're just not the same person. And so you're just always not using your strong leg or arm. And I mean, for me, it's like there's a resonance there because I jump off my right leg, which I'm not supposed to. I'm supposed to jump off my left leg, and if I'm right-handed. But somewhere when I was a small child, they switched me from being right-handed to left-handed, but they forgot the rest of my body would not pick up that cue. So I would always, you know, playing basketball, jump off my right leg and try to lay up with my right leg, and it doesn't really work until some guy who plays basketball said, "You're doing that wrong." And I go, "Isn't that what everybody does?" He goes, "No, you know, you're supposed to do it like this." And I realized, but when I was a hurdler, jumping off like a left-handed guy was perfect because I always landed on the inside of the track on the turns. And I realized, oh, so I have a huge advantage as a hurdler because my left leg is always landing right on that line, and I could pick up more speed than other runners who were right-handed. But as a basketball player, because they messed me up, it was really a challenge. You kind of have to figure out where the way you're designed gives you your optimal effect and impact. It's the same way when it comes to like ministry and evangelism. I'm an immigrant from El Salvador. I mean, Spanish was my first language. I learned English here in the States. So I think from the beginning I had an advantage of being an outsider looking in. And so that was always my perspective of life and of the world. I knew what it was like to not belong. I knew what it was like to try to navigate your way from the fringes and try to find some acceptance in the center. And I think that's part of what shapes Mosaic. I always lived in cities. I'm from San Salvador, lived in Miami, lived in New York. We moved to a small village called Raleigh, and it's the capital of North Carolina. And then lived in Dallas, Fort Worth, and then moved to Los Angeles. And so cities are really my arena, my playground. That's the place I understand. And the diversity of the world, it was always a common experience for me. My grandmother was Roman Catholic, but we never went to Mass. But we were Roman Catholic. And if you're Latin and you're Roman Catholic, you understand. You don't have to go to Mass. You just are. It's, right? It's
you
like
got it covered from birth.
It's like being Texan, and you just are, and my grandfather was an atheist who believed in reincarnation. And so he took me by a house, and he said a little boy was about 8 or 9 years old, died. And he said then he was reincarnated, and my grandfather said, and that's me. And so I was raised believing in reincarnation and in Roman Catholicism, but I never heard about the resurrection. I only saw Jesus crucified. And we went to Mass maybe 4 times in my childhood. It was always Latin Masses, pre-Vatican II. And so everything was in Latin, so there was an ancient kind of religion, ancient faith, and I never had a negative feeling about it. I always thought it was really beautiful, mysterious, a bit ominous, but cool. And so I wasn't against religion, I just didn't know it was religion at all. And I didn't know people went back the next week. I thought once a year they would rent out these amazing cathedrals, and they would celebrate Easter, or Palm Sunday, whichever one we were there for. And so that was like my religious background. Then my mom, when I didn't know my mom until I was 5. I never really knew my father. He was a linguist, spoke about a dozen languages, so languages always became really important to me. My mom was a linguist, spoke half a dozen languages, and so the essence and nature of language was important to me. And that shapes how Mosaic is. You know, you can just kind of look back and realize that the story begins early. The stuff inside of you, it comes early. And I wasn't a follower of Christ. And then my mom came and took us from El Salvador when I was around 5. And she married a guy in what we called creative underground economies, you know, and you'll understand that later. And I owed a really kind Italian family from Chicago about $1 million in gambling debt. And so took on an alias, and that's how he became McManus. And that wasn't his name either. He took us to a police station, convinced the police we'd been robbed, and that we needed new identity. We walked out McManus. And so I became Irish, you know, in one day, you know. And so I grew up having an alias all my life. An Irish last name, a German first name, which wasn't my name either.
Irish guy with a good tan.
Yeah, there you go. It's called being Spanish, John.
It was a joke from last night.
Yes, that's right. I was in Chicago. They kept saying, "Wow, you're tan." I kept saying, "I think it's that I'm Spanish." But, you know, I don't know. I felt really awkward in Chicago. Yeah, and so you have all these different things informing you. But around the age of maybe 11, my mom brought a Buddha home. And we became Buddhists, and we were like the first Latin Buddhists in the world. I'm sure we were pioneers, you know. And so I was introduced to an Asian narrative in my life very, very early. Didn't know a lot about Buddha, didn't know a lot about the background, but he was there in our house until one day our lives went really badly. My mom got really angry and destroyed Buddha in the backyard, and she decided he was an idol, and somehow, like, you know, bad mojo was coming to our house, you know. And then she picked up a book by Rabbi Kishner on why bad things happen to good people. And she said, I'm Jewish. Because there was an earthquake in Central America. And she said, there's no way a loving God could allow so many innocent people to be killed randomly. And so I don't believe in God anymore. I believe there's a God who created everything, but he's indifferent and inactive in human history. So my mom was saying she was Jewish, but she was really saying she was a deist. And that was all before I was 12 years old. You know, those were the religious influences in my life. And so I was a straight D student, and first through 12th grade, pretty solid. But I did read every single mythology book in the library by the time I was 12. And a neighbor of mine who was Jewish was a part of the Junior Scientists Foundation. And he brought a book over into our backyard one day, which actually was rather risque now that I realize it. But it was written by a guy named Robert Heinlein, who was a physicist who was a science fiction writer. And so I became addicted to the world of science fiction. And at the age of 10, I read everything Heinlein ever wrote. And then I found Bradbury and Norton and Asimov. And they became the universe in which I lived. And I remember one particular story that was about this space traveler who traveled from worlds to worlds. And every time he got to a different world, he was in the crucifixion scene. But each time it was just after Jesus was killed. And then he got to the next planet, and he was there just a little bit earlier. And so he was like traveling from world to world, trying to get to that world so he could meet Jesus before he was crucified. And that was my first Jesus narrative. And so in my mind, it was incredibly plausible that there was a God figure out there dying for all the races and all the species across the universe. I've never told anyone
Robert
that.
Heinlein.
Through Heinlein, yeah. And but I also understood the horrific nature of obsessive compulsive behavior. And once I read about a man who went insane not because he could count all the raindrops, but all the spaces in between the raindrops. And I never forgot that phrase because I felt that was me. And so by the age of 12, I was in a psychiatric chair, and I was in a hospital, and they performed surgery. I have a scar across my stomach where they opened me up to see if there's something wrong with me. There was nothing wrong with my body. It was my soul that was sick. And I began losing the ability to distinguish between the world inside of my imagination and the world of reality. And you may not think this is about church planning. And
but it is.
But
He's getting there.
And I thought I was already there, John. And but that's just my perspective, you know. And but I'm sure as an engineer, we're getting there. And, but somebody has to imagine the airplane before someone starts thinking about how we're building the airplane.
Right.
And,
I'm already hearing your story of how God got you to Los Angeles.
yeah, no, and so when I entered into this first narrative with Jesus, I was a philosophy student in college, and I was not studying philosophy because I was an intellectual, and no one really accused me of that. You know, I was studying philosophy because I was searching for meaning in life. I was hoping that someone who had thought about this longer and harder than me could give me a reason to live, a reason for my existence. And you cannot know the incredible sense of angst and despair that overwhelms a person when they would read the greatest minds in the world. And at the end, you would feel that they were as lost as I was. And that just became my reoccurring theme. Going there, they ended where I beginning. And they began where I began. Is there any hope for me? And in the middle of that, my mom called me up and said, I'm a Christian. I had no idea what that was. See, and I think a lot of us, because we're such insiders, we think everybody knows what we're talking about. I'd never heard that phrase in my life. And I just said, that's wonderful. And the only reason I said it was wonderful because she seemed happy. So I thought, like she was saying, I'm a humanitarian, or I'm a vegetarian, or something like that. You know, I'm joining the Peace Corps, and I didn't even know there were churches. And so I went home for spring break, and she took me to church. I was shocked to see like this monolithic, giant place with thousands of people. It was a mega church. But the choir had robes on, and the preacher was very Southern, and he told really canned jokes, and that you probably get out of a book. But he was so winsome and so magnetic. And somehow, when they would drag me to church, and my mom was getting baptized, my mom was singing in this choir, my sisters were getting baptized, my other sister was getting baptized, my brother who was an atheist was going to church, and they just kept dragging me to church. And somehow, even though the talk seemed like it was, and the place was irrelevant to me, something was happening inside of me. I couldn't get that feeling like to not like sneak in. Like, oh, that's weird, you know? And then at the end, he would just really openly talk about Jesus. I thought, yeah, they kind of have like they're fixated on an agenda. You know, and I mean, they need to become broader than that. But and they gave the offering before the talk, and I would think to myself, how do I know how much to tip the guy if I haven't heard him first? I mean, that's literally what I thought to myself. You know, it's like, wow, this is like a bait and switch.
Because if you do it after, you actually get less than if you do it before.
You know, strangely enough, we found the opposite to be true. You know, we take it at the end, so people go, oh, that was really good. And
you do too.
Right, you do too, don't you?
We get less.
Yeah, you get less? Oh, wow. And, okay. And that's a different seminar. But, you know, and so you do that. And so it was, and then my brother was an atheist. And when we were home for the summer from college, he started reading a Bible and going to church. And I said, why are you going to church? He said, you're an atheist. It just seems to me hypocritical. And I said, because I trust the man who invited me. Because you see, a guy showed up at our house, or our apartment, and we were dirt poor. And this guy shows up at our apartment, 2 people, and they knocked on the door, and they said they're from First Baptist Church. And I said, come on in. And I let him inside, then I left. And I did. And I was that guy. You know, and I let my family deal with them. And they were like Jehovah's Witnesses to me. You know, I was like, you know, sure, go ahead, go on in. And I just went. And then when I saw him drive off, I came back. And but the guy invited my brother, and he said, there's great volleyball and beautiful girls. And
whatever it takes.
Yeah, and my brother, and I said, how's the volleyball? And he said, it's average. And I said, how are the girls? Yeah, he goes, he was right. And you know, so I said, well, I could use a little religion. You know? And so I started playing volleyball, you know, and that volleyball was decent, but it wasn't phenomenal, you know, but at least it gave us a context to win. And then the girls were beautiful, you know, and the people were actually beautiful.
Where's this First Baptist?
Orlando, Florida. Yeah, if you're single, it's a good place to go. Well, now they're
the place
really
where
old.
Exponential happens?
Yeah.
That place?
That place where I came to faith.
Giant.
I know. And but
wow.
I came to faith when they were downtown. See, and so I watched my family go through this transformation toward Christ, which actually affects what I do now. because I started watching people I knew who did not believe start to believe. And I watched my brother, who was an atheist, when I saw him with the Bible, I said, what are you doing carrying a Bible around? And he goes, if I become a Christian, it's not going to be an emotional decision. It's going to be an intellectual decision. And I looked at him, I said, you're lying. You're just about to fall, and you're making excuses. And because I saw that he was like crumbling under the weight of religion, weight of belief, and I thought he was like trying to like set himself up so he could still be an intellectual, right? But he was almost like exorcised to Christ, because he was a really dark person. And the American Indian, the Native American Indian who led him to Christ, my brother could not say the name of Jesus. And in the middle of the time of trying to lead him to Christ, the man said, I command all the hindering spirits to release Alex. This is in a Southern Baptist church. Because you know how I know this? Because my brother told me this after he came to Christ. He goes, it was weird, Erwin. I was trying to give my life to God. I'm still a non-believer. And he goes, I couldn't say the name of Jesus. And he goes, this guy goes, I command all the hindering spirits to release him. In that moment, I started praying and giving my life to Jesus. This is an atheist saying that. And because I think we categorize things in belief systems, and those aren't real categories. And so I thought, wow, that's kind of cool, you know. And then I had kind of a spiritual experience watching it from a distance one day, and then I knew I was an outsider looking in again, and I started to believe, but I knew I was outside. Like I believed in God before I was willing to give my life to God. Then, you know. And so then
Did you believe in God before you believed in Jesus?
I believed in transcendence.
Okay.
I believed that I was always a mystical person, and I'm that guy that, you know, I would practice astral projection and trance channeling. I would spend hours every day working on moving objects and using the power of the mind. I was 10 when I would do that, and because of that, I had like massive odd sleep disorders. And in El Salvador, where our houses are gated and walled and bars in the windows, almost every night they would find me in the city of San Salvador walking the streets. And the police knew me well enough as a little boy to bring me home.
Wow.
And my grandparents, nobody could ever figure out how I got out. I would do that in my sleep. Wow. And so I knew I was tapping into, you know, some really unorthodox, maybe dark places, but I never saw it as darkness. I was trying to connect to whatever was beyond us. For me, I wasn't trying to connect to evil. I wasn't trying to connect. I felt there was like a good out there, and I would call it God, you know, and I felt that we were all connected to whatever God was, and I didn't want to be limited to this material, physical world, because I felt it was empty. So I was actually trying to live a transcendent life. I just didn't know who God was, you know. And I think sometimes we just assume that people aren't out there trying to connect to God, but they are.
Or that God's going to stay away from them until we can fix that.
Yeah, you know. And so I remember once having a conversation with Jesus, but I did cuss him out, and because he wouldn't show up. You know, so I thought if I can cuss God out, maybe I can get him to act if he's out there and respond to me. And when there was no response, I thought, yeah, not happening. You know, and that's when I became more distant from that. And so anyway, so when I came to faith in Jesus, I remember thinking to myself, I guess the guy's got to say that cast out hindering spirits thing. It was a different guy, and he never did, and he didn't know to do that. And so in my head I said, okay, whatever like those things are, I command you to leave. I just did it inside my own head, you know, wow. And because you start thinking that whatever the last guy did is what you got to do, because you don't know, right, you know. And but some guy hands me a Bible, the only African American in the whole church. And he handed me a Bible with my name engraved on it, like literally when I came to Christ. I didn't know how he did it. My name was on there, Erwin McManus, and I thought he's like one of the deacons or pastors or leaders, and he was actually the janitor.
Wow.
And he walked up to me right after I came to Christ. Somehow he knew I would come to Christ. And he said, 3 years ago, a man named Scott Leonard walked up to me and told me I was called to preach the gospel. And 3 years before that, another man, he said, told Scott Leonard, you're called to preach the gospel. Because I've waited for 3 years for the person that God would tell me. And he hands me this leather-bound King James Thompson Chain Reference Bible with my name engraved on it the moment I came to Christ, and said, God has called you to preach the gospel. I'd never even heard that phrase in my whole life. And so I became a follower of Christ, and the guy says to me, you're commissioned to preach the gospel to the world. And I thought, wow, this is
And
cool.
you believed him.
I didn't know they didn't do that for everyone. See, you see, I thought you get like your own like personal like guy, and so I was baptized the next week, 1 week after I came to Christ, and then the Monday I left and went back to university, and that's all I knew about Christianity. That was all the discipleship I got. That was all the mentoring. They just told me, read the Bible, memorize. They gave me these little cards, with scriptures on them, right? Said, memorize all this. Pray every day. Tell people about Jesus. I came to Christ on a Sunday night. I led my first person to Christ that Friday night. And by myself.
Wow.
And then I was baptized the next Sunday. And I go, like, if you lead someone to Christ before you're baptized, you have a pretty good sense that guy's going to stick. And so that just went boom, boom, boom like that for me. Then I went back to college on Monday, and then when I got to the college, this nun called me up, and the only time I'd ever been around this Catholic church is I walked in because my roommate asked me to go. She hands me the Bible and says, "I want you to do the scripture reading." This is before I became a follower, and I said, "Woman, get that book away from me. I don't want to touch it." And that was my only encounter with this nun. So she calls me up. I go back to college, and she asked to meet with me. It made me very nervous. I was afraid of the Catholic nuns, and as all Catholics should be. And we meet this little hamburger shop, and she said, we're doing a 6-week convocation with all these different denominations, and I would like for you to lead these 6 weeks and be the speaker every week. I'm the guy that wouldn't touch the Bible. I looked at her and I said, I need to tell you something, because worse than being like an atheist or an unbeliever, I was now baptized by Baptist. And that's like really bad, I'm telling you. And I said, Sister Marge, her name was Marge Paulus, I'll never forget. I said, Sister Marge, I need to tell you that I was baptized yesterday as a follower of Jesus. And I don't know how that affects, your feelings, about this. And she said, God spoke to me in a dream and told me he was going to take your life, and that I was to put you in charge. See, and I'm saying this because church planting can't be about systems and strategies and structures and methodologies. It has to be about standing in the intersection of what God is doing in humanity, and just creating this magnetic, sticky place where people who are searching for God find God in you and through you. And I know it's not a great methodology, but it's the only one I'm going to come and advocate, because I find a lot of church planters who are more like construction workers. Like they want to build a building and they want the formula and they want the map, but they don't really have the essence. And to me it's like you can build a building, but without essence, it's just going to be hollow and empty. You go, how do you reach these people? The only people you're going to reach are the people that you like and that like you. At least at first. I guess after a while, the great advantage we get is that when you reach other people, they can like the people that are here, not just you. Right? When you reach tribal leaders, the people you reach are the people that like that tribal leader, are drawn to them. Because really the churches that grow fastest and largest, there's a leader who reaches tribal leaders. And then those people bring their tribes together. And you're the convener of many tribes. But at first, you've got to find your tribe. You've got to find the people who don't know Christ, for whom you are like their voice for God. And I planted a lot of churches. I was really bad at it. I was sometimes it looked ineffective. Sometimes it looked like my talent was below average. And when I went to LA, all of a sudden I became really talented. It was really easy for me in LA. But it wasn't at first. When I first moved to LA, my next door neighbor, who owned a lawn company business, we started talking in the front yard, and in the first 10 minutes he quoted 5 movies that I had never seen, that I hadn't even heard of. And I hadn't seen a movie in 10 years because when I became a Christian, they told me, you can't go see movies, you can't watch TV, you have to burn all your philosophy books. So I became like a monastic. I lived out of a paper bag. Everything I owned, I could put into a paper bag. And I never made more than $12,000 a year for the first 10 to 12 years as a Christian. Because I was trying to live the life of Jesus. And I didn't know how to do that. And so I used to go to film festivals and watch 5 to 6 films a week. And I used to spend a week taking on a character, taking on that accent, and being that
that personality, and that was my whole world. I didn't went to church, but I went to movies all my life. So now I didn't go to see anything. And this guy's like talking about all these movies, and the fifth one he said was The Prince of Tides. And I had just seen my first movie in 12 years. It was called The Princess Bride. And it had come out 10 years before, but somebody showed it to me on this like thing, this video thing, which I didn't even know existed. I was so out of touch with culture.
Because that's what you heard you were supposed to do?
So I spent those 10 years working with drug cartels and among the urban poor. And so it just was an irrelevant world when you're working in the world of prostitution and drugs and gangs and everything else. So that was my world for a decade. And so I said, I've seen that one, because I thought he said The Princess Bride. And then he started mentioning Nick Nolte, and I thought, oh, it's not the same movie. But I didn't say anything. And I told my wife, I said, I can't reach L.A. because I don't speak the language of the city. So I went and I found this thing called a VCR, and I bought it. I put in like $200. It was like so much money. That was a huge amount of money for us. Then I went to this place called Blockbuster, which I found out you could become a member. And I became a member of Blockbuster. And then I said, I want every single movie that has ever been made in Los Angeles. And I took every single movie that had ever been made on LA, from G to almost X, and because, there's some, R-rated movies that are pretty violent and about LA. And I just sat there one by one and watched every single movie ever made about Los Angeles. And I just learned the story of the culture, of the people. And what's funny is I felt like I was once again alive. I was the person that I was, not someone that everyone else was trying to make me. And honestly, evangelism was so easy. I don't know how people struggle with evangelism. To me, I don't know how you avoid having conversations about God. I'm a social introvert. I do everything I can not to have conversations with people. I can't stop people from talking to me about God. Because if you carry their essence and you add to that hope, people will find you. To me, that's Mosaic's story. People ask me, why did you start Mosaic? Or were you thinking about doing a church? I was just trying to find a place where I belonged. There was a part of it that was really selfish. And then I was trying to find a place where I could bring people I loved. Like one of the first people I connected to Mosaic was a guy who ended up writing on Dexter for 5-6 years and now writes for The Following. I mean, he's a pretty dark writer, but we've been friends for almost 20 years. And I'm going, how do I create a space for him? Brilliant guy, cynical, and artistic. And I had so many friends that I was bringing to faith. I mean, even when I started a black church. And I was a pastor at an African-American church for 6 years. You know why? Because I started leading all these drug cartel guys to Christ. Nobody wanted them. Like, I didn't start a church so I could be the pastor or be a founder or speak at conferences. And I started churches because my friends didn't have anywhere to go. And so I wasn't like, I'm starting a church. How do I reach a demographic? I was always, what do I do with these people? No one will take care of them or want them, or and I thought, if they meet each other, they'll be friends. Yeah. And that's for me how churches really grew, and that's for me how Mosaic has grown. People, how are you so diverse? Well, one is I like diverse people. If you don't like diversity, you're not going to have diversity. I consulted for this church. You would know them, but I'm not going to say who they are. They asked me, how do we become diverse? And I said, well, are you willing to have your daughters marry people of color? I mean, the meeting was over. It was over, and they paid me to consult. And they just got real quiet. And I said, yeah, you're not going to be diverse because you just want your sons and daughters to marry white kids. And it's just not going to happen. Everybody will read through your pretense. Yeah. Yeah. And you just have to love people who are different. Yeah. And I think that's Mosaic. Mosaic is the byproduct of my own journey, of my own attempt to find a place to belong in the world. And I have a lot of friends who, throughout my life, who didn't know Jesus, came to Jesus, who needed a place to belong. And when they started belonging, they started telling other people, there's a place for you. Mm-hmm. And you got, the gay question came up. And, yesterday, my book, The Artist and Soul, came out on Tuesday. Yesterday, Jason Collins, the NBA player, was the first gay player, in NBA history, sent out a Twitter saying, my friend Erwin McManus has a new book called The Artist and Soul. Went out to his 1.2 million people. And I was so excited and so grateful that he would do that. And what he's told to everyone in the gay community? You can trust these people. They're safe. you know. And we had lunch, and I said, Jason, we don't agree on a lot of things, on a few critical issues, but we need to teach the world how to walk together. And then one of our elders, who's older, we were driving away, and he goes, how far are you going to take all this? And I said, as far as love will take us. I just think a lot of us want to stay really close to home, but I want to travel as far as love will take me. And I just want to keep getting pressed and stretched, and I want my heart to get bigger and my faith to get bigger. I just want God to keep surprising me about how much I can love and how powerful love can be in the world. If you're going to plant a church, do it for the reason that humanity needs what only God can provide. Yeah. And people need a place to discover that and experience it fully. That's my story. Sorry, I went long.
No, that's great. That's great stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I think what you're hitting on. I mean, when you look at Paul in Acts chapter 14, Acts chapter 17. So many times we read Paul and we see all of his corrections of the church. But I think what we don't see in every one of his letters is how much he loved them.
Yeah.
Like, look at what he starts off with and look at what he ends with. Even the messiest, craziest church, like Corinthians, right? Where they're bragging about sleeping with their stepmother and they're getting drunk at communion. And he starts off talking about how they are the beloved. And they're, in Acts chapter 14, where Paul goes into Lystra, and he sees these pagan, idol-worshiping people, and he goes, God has not left himself without testimony here. And I'm listening to your story, and I'm thinking, God was already at work in your life before you ever encountered a Christian.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Even through the narratives and the metaphors of, science fiction books and this longing, this spiritual transcendent longing. Right?
Yeah, it's our hero C.S. Lewis who tells us we should never war against any mythology, because within every mythology there's a narrative of Christ. Yeah, and we spend all of our time fighting everything that's false, and which actually makes us false.
So that's another, I think, really important thing that I hear in what you're saying is, instead of thinking about, okay, we're going to go to the world and Christianity is helping, even clean up the mud, right? Mm-hmm. It's really about life. It's like, how do we live a life? That's what Jesus said. It's an abundant life, but it's also where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. So it's life and it's freedom. And how do you create this place where that life and that freedom gets extended?
Yeah, we've both been to Unri Church out in Seoul, Korea.
Yeah.
And you've been there? It's a great place. Well, this guy was planting a church. It was there just like August, and he said, I'm planting a church. I've been interviewing all of my pastors about what I need to be successful. And he goes, so what would you say I need? And what kind of core team do I need? And I knew what he was expecting me to say. I said, just look for two characteristics in people. Find people who are fun and who are likable. And he goes, what? And I said, yeah. I know you're going to find people who love God, love the Bible, pray. You're Korean. Everybody prays, And it's like
at 5 a.m.
It's sort of a given, right? I said, you want to plant a great church? Find people who are incredibly likable. They're just kind. And they enjoy people, but find people who enjoy life. And if you find people who enjoy life and love people, you're just going to go crazy. And he looked at me really shocked. He goes, no one's actually told me this. And I said, it's funny because the worst thing to do is start a church and draw all the Christians who are angry at the last church they're at. And they're going, finally I get a pastor of my own. That's you. You're going to love it at first. You're going to hate your life very, very soon.
And this is going to be the church I want it to be.
Yeah.
Finally.
Yeah.
That doesn't work well.
At last. It's so much better when you find people who go, look, I just want a place where I can bring all my friends. I want a place where I know that when you speak on Sunday, you're going to treat them with love and respect. And I know that when you speak on Sunday, it's going to be understandable. And my first experience was at the summit with Unri Church. Because when I was speaking at the Leadership Summit 10 years ago, they couldn't translate me. So the Korean translator stopped in the middle of my talk and gave up. He gave up. And so Pastor Haas sent another guy running to the sound booth, like to see if he was okay, if he blacked out, if there was some kind of, and he was paralyzed. He just literally gave up. And so the other guy took up the headset and started translating for me. And so they came to me right after that and said, we want you to come to Seoul. And I said, but we have a problem. We don't know how to translate you. And I said, well, help me understand why. And you see, in Korea, there are two Korean languages. There's Korean, the Korean speak, and then there's Christian Korean. And Christianity has created such a subset of culture that they have a language in and of themselves.
We do too.
Yeah, I know. And so the translator couldn't translate me because I didn't use any Christian language. And I said, okay, find an unbelieving Korean, because what I'm speaking is human. And so you need a human. And most Christians are still humans, but so many of them are not. You know? And it's funny, so they would always find someone from like a PhD from Harvard or, you know, that would translate me. And because they thought it was really complex. It was so simple. And I said, I promise you can get a guy off the street who has never been to church, doesn't believe in God, he could translate me easy. And so that was a part of like our journey, you know. And I think that's a part of the difficulty in the church, is that, you know, if you're going to be the person who's the point person, the spokesperson, I always tell myself, my responsibility in speaking is to be the voice for those people who don't have a voice. I mean, what's the point of starting a church if they already have someone who actually is their voice down the street? Then you're just competing for the same people.
Let's go that direction.
All right.
So
aren't you supposed to tell like your story?
I kind of already did, didn't I? Or did I?
Well, I'm just saying those are the rules.
Oh. Well, okay. I'll tell a short version that maybe in some ways is similar. Is that I grew up exposed to church, but I didn't get church. It's very liturgical. It's very formal. In reality, I think it was kind of a social club that my parents felt like they were supposed to belong to. And so I had tons of questions, you know, kind of like, you're the artist, I'm the engineer. I'm like, well, how do you know Jesus is the Son of God? Do you really believe this? Why do you believe this? And I'd ask my questions, and nobody seemed interested in answering. I don't know if they had answers. And when I got old enough, I don't know, 6th grade, 7th grade, I remember it was the year before my first real drunk. That's kind of how I measured it. And I said, I'm done with this. It makes no sense to me. And then I kind of just started going down the road of partying and living for me. And it was people coming to me. It wasn't me going to church. It was people coming to me who just loved me right where I was, loved my friends right where I was. My friends started exploring faith. I was going through, watching my dad die, and that kind of got my attention, like, wow, maybe the universe doesn't go the way I want, because that wasn't supposed to happen. And so I went to this small group, and I wrestled with my questions, and we were looking at the Bible, and I didn't understand it. I kept asking, and it took me about 8 months, and then I came to believe this is true. I'll never forget it's not an intellectual deal, because then all of a sudden it was like, oh, crud, now what? And then I realized, oh, it's a surrender deal. It's a, what am I going to do with God now? And so I finally did yield my life to him. And maybe in a similar way, so I'm in this small group, and I'm growing in this small group for about a year, and a year later, the guy said, okay, now, I'm going to do it with you, but you're going to lead a small group of people who are younger than you spiritually. So 1 year into it. And that did more for me than anything. And I was still kind of a mess. Like, I still hadn't quit drinking excessively. And so we had to deal with that along the way. But within 3 years of coming to faith, I led others to faith. I was in a small group. I was leading a small group, and some of those people were leading a small group as well. And so I guess, kind of a similarity, maybe in some ways, I know my heart, and it sounds like your heart too, for ordinary humans, grew out of being an ordinary human who desperately needed Jesus. And I just didn't have any people who cared to deal with me enough to help me understand. But once I did, and once they put up with my wrestling and my doubts and my questions long enough, I got it. And then pretty quickly got me involved as well. And so when we came and planted Gateway 15 years ago, we really were what I felt. It was kind of a weird thing because I felt God's heart for this lost, broken humanity. Like I would be driving. I remember driving down Algonquin Road in Chicago. And I would hear, this is back when Joan Osborne, If God Were One of Us. I'd hear like songs like that. And I would be weeping. Because in the lyrics, I could hear the cries of a generation longing for him, but a church that didn't really care that much. A church that actually cared more about what I want and what's going to help me or feed me or do my thing. And and God broke my heart over that. So when we came to Austin, in a very similar way, it's like I only knew one person, so I just started meeting people. And just started getting to know them relationally and talking about, my faith and hearing their story. And if they weren't believers, saying, hey, I think God wants to start a church for you, for people like you and your friends. You want to come help us figure out what that would look like? So these are people who don't believe yet. But you can see that God was at work in their lives, kind of like Erwin. It's like he's already doing something. You just got to listen long enough to hear, what is he doing? Where is he trying to get their attention? And so in that first small group, I told the church planner guys yesterday that I had a phone list that I had gotten together of the people I had met and interacted with, and there were 100 names, phone numbers, email addresses, of just relationships that I'd built in the first probably 3 or 4 months. And I was only able to get 10 of those to come to a small group I started at Nate's house. But some of those, it took them years, but then they started to join us. So from the very start, it was very relational. And I think you're absolutely right. It's like, if you don't get where people are coming from who are not yet part of a church, and you don't really care about them, they can sense that, and you're never going to create that place where they can find faith.
Yeah, I think one interesting thing is I just think about our same intention of seeing people come to know Christ and to be like fully formed followers of Christ and to be engaged in the world themselves. But we come at it from very, very different places. I think you have a very strong leadership gift, a very strong even organizational leadership gift. And I think I'm probably like more of a cultural lockpick,
Mm-hmm.
And if I had better leadership gifts, we'd be huge. We would just be we would be a monster, But I'm just better at breaking into places that people think can't break into. And so I think some of it is you just got to figure out what your unique way of approaching this thing is.
Well, and don't you think too, recognizing that you got to have the body. That's why God has different gifts and different, Eric. And
Eric was really, he would just follow around and put my chaos into order, and while he could function as a human. But I'm Mosaic is so much stronger now that we have Lawrence Fudge and Hank Fortner, and their leadership gifts are just so powerful and complementary to who I am. And they're probably more structured than, and nobody, Lawrence more than you. I think the same Myers-Briggs, Z and TJ, right? Or, and which was what I feel. and you know, and so really what's happened at Mosaic is they've been able to harness all that momentum into a really powerful focus.
Yeah.
And so teaming is really important. Community is really important. I think it's understated, but you have to be able to communicate effectively.
Yeah. And to the spectrum, right? Mm-hmm. I mean,
I think I can't figure this thing out completely. Because there's a lot of speakers I hear and I go, gosh, it doesn't do anything for me. But they have 30,000 people, so clearly I'm in the minority. And they just speak to a really narrow group. So I think if it's really narrow, you have to be really good for that narrow space. And there has to be a lot of people like that. And because
when you speak, are you thinking about people who are far from God mainly? People who are already following God, or both? How do you think that way?
See, I think about what is true for every human being. Mm-hmm. If it isn't true for everyone, I think it's a lie for Christians.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good.
And so I don't think about an unbeliever or a believer. I think about speaking to the core of humanity.
Yeah. Which is what Jesus is all about.
I hope so, or I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
And so I never thought about, people say, are you seeker sensitive? I was always joking, say I'm insensitive to everyone.
Equally.
It's like, because when you're going inside of someone's soul, it's going to get a little tricky.
Yeah.
But I do feel like my posture is very mystical. I'm not trying to transmit information. I'm trying to create moments that are transcendent, where everyone has an unexplainable encounter with God. And so that's a part of the way I kind of think through the whole aspect. I'm not a very linear person, and so
That's what I get from you.
My wife actually came to me and she says, people need concrete. That's what she told me. And I said, I don't do concrete. She was like, they need concrete. And so I wrote a series called Concrete, because that was like that. If I write the series called Concrete, I can get there. And after my first talk, I went to her and said, so how'd I do? She goes, the only thing concrete about your talk was the title. But here's the thing: is like mega churches tend to. Are you familiar with the adopter categorization? He's familiar. Okay. All right. It's real simple.
How people
adopt change.
Yeah.
All right. So it's sort of like this: 2.2% of people are innovators. 12.4% of people or something like that are early adopters. 34.1 are early majority. 34.1 are late majority. 12.4 are late adopters, and then 2.2 are called. They call them laggards, but I thought that was mean, so we call them nostalgics. People who love the past. And mega churches reach that 65% of early and late majority. That's not a bad thing. That's humans, and they need to be reached for Christ. But when you're speaking to a large, broad audience, you're reaching that early and late majority. And really what you're doing is speaking to the early majority, and when then they respond to Christ, the majority follows them. Most churches across America are led by late majority and nostalgics. The pastors are late majority and nostalgics. And most of the theologians are late majority and nostalgics. Most people who have those hate blog sites that tell everybody else is a heretic are late majority and nostalgics. And what Mosaic is you see, I strategically and on purpose targeted innovators and early adopters. Mosaic is essentially the top 15% of culture. And so because of that, we reach a lot of people that eventually go to other churches, because our core narrative doesn't really match their natural ebb and flow of life. So we lead late adopters to Christ. But eventually they realize, there's a church that moves a lot slower, and I feel more comfortable there. And then we reach people who are high intuitives. And so on the Myers-Briggs, I think the last one we did, it was like 70% of the people were ENFPs. It wasn't just even NFs. They were in one quadrant. That quadrant is just under 2% of all the population, and 70% were in that one quadrant. And so if you start adding Mosaic up, about 90%, I would say, are intuitives, and about 10% are sensing. It's not because we don't love sensing people, and not because we don't try to reach them. It's because they don't understand me. And I want to be understood. And it's not because I try not to be understood. I am incapable of continually speaking effectively into a concrete sensing culture. I'm not linear, and I'm not sequential. I'm systemic. And so it's only about 5% of people. So I could lament all my life that God didn't make me Billy Graham. I could lament all my life He didn't make me, whatever, Joel Osteen or Joyce Meyer, because they speak to millions and millions and millions of people. As much as you want to berate them, they're really effective at reaching a really, really large audience. But if you understand who you are and go, okay, I'm going to be the best in the world at reaching who God made me, and I'm going to give them a voice so they can find a place to belong. But our podcast has nearly 500,000 people around the world without any advertising. Because you see, those early adopters and innovators, they're really lonely. And they don't have a voice for them. They don't have a voice that explains the scriptures, explains Jesus, or makes sense of life. And so some of it is like, as a church planter especially, as a voice, you have to. I would always tell people come to me all the time and go, we're leaving because you don't feed us anymore. You ever have that? Never. Okay. And
why are they laughing?
Yeah. And because sometimes the truth is just so funny.
It's just so hard.
Yeah.
It's just so hard, I'd rather deny it.
But, sometimes I'd have people come and say, we left that church because, you feed us. And for a while I was really complimented until the ratio was greater leaving than coming. But what I realized is like that, one, I would always tell people, I'm amazed anyone is fed by my teaching. So the fact that you're not being fed by me just affirms my sense of reality. It's a miracle. Anyone listens to me, And but two, it's like sometimes people are like vegetarians or carnivores. Sometimes they're just inclined toward paleo, or they're even like vegans. And you have a style, an approach toward life, an approach toward truth, an approach toward scriptures that resonates with certain people, and it'll draw them into the kingdom of God. Yeah. It draws them into who Jesus is. And then there are other churches whose style actually doesn't reach anyone who's lost. They're just really good at taking believers who are now realizing there's a broader conversation. And I used to get so frustrated. There are more people we've led to Christ in other churches in LA than probably Mosaic. We've helped a lot of churches grow really large.
I think it is an important thing, because you said something to me when I told you about this conversation and trying to actually help the church grow. Out of people who are lost who then start leading others. And you said, you're trying to get people to plant churches that'll fail. Or you said something like that. Or you're trying to get them to do the hardest thing.
Yeah, here's the problem. How many are actually already planting a church? Okay, there's a few of you. How many are planning two? How many are just here because John's here and he's so good looking you just want to look at him all day long? And what's your reason for being here?
Don't do that. No one's going to raise their hand.
And the dilemma is the skills to grow a church fast are different than the skills of reaching an unbelieving world.
Yep.
And
say about growing a church fast.
Yeah, I've been around a long time. I mean, I'm old. You're actually young.
Oh.
How old are you? Come on, how old are you?
You go first.
50.
I'm 55.
You're 5 years older than me.
All right. And all right, so we've been around.
Yeah.
We've been around, and I remember the first time I heard about this church exploding. I was pastoring an inner city church with 50 people, still wearing a polyester suit that would melt by the space heater in the house we were renting. I mean, and I heard about this church has exploded. Like, the guy, had a cup of coffee and there was 8,000 people,
Yeah.
And I sat in my wife's Pinto, Yes, that was the life God gave me, right? Yellow Pinto. And I wept uncontrollably as I listened to the radio and heard their story. It was just down like 30 minutes from where I was. I was in the lowest income, highest crime rate area of Dallas, and they were in the suburbs in the most affluent area of the city. And I just sobbed. I couldn't control myself from weeping. And I had really like two questions, like, you know, God, why? You know, would you do that for them and not for us? Mm-hmm. And two, do I have what it takes? Is it just I just don't have the talent, you know, the gifting to make this thing go?
Because you were thinking success is that, fast growth?
Well, I just become a Christian, and that's all Christians talked about. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the whole measure of whether God's anointed you or gifted you or called you, right? And I mean, I was leading some hardcore people to Jesus. Mm-hmm. I mean, the kingpins in the drug world, but it just didn't show up on the Christian map.
Right.
You know, it's a slow burn. You know?
And I think that's really a huge thing you got to take in. Like, if the goal is becoming somebody, don't plant a church to reach lost people.
Yeah, the best way to look awesome is to pastor a church for like 2 to 3 years and then get a larger church. And then pastor for 2 or 3 years and get a larger one. So you'll look like you're growing churches by constantly moving up to a bigger one. It is, you know that. And it's you know, it's an easy way to do it, but it's not easy because you'll spend your whole life with Christians, and so there's a price you will pay, you know, for it.
Well, we were joking around last night. Eric's come up to shut us off. We were joking around last night about how, especially at Gateway, and you were saying a similar thing, that, you know, when in the early days, I mean, it was 100 the first year, it was 200 the second year, it was 300 the third year, it was about 400 to 500 the fourth year. You know, it's like, yeah. But people were so grateful. You didn't have to deal with. I mean, when he's joking about Christians, he's talking about the culture of Christianity that is so narcissistic and me-centered, and I mean, really, I think doesn't have any mercy in their hearts for anybody except themselves.
Yeah, you know, I have this little bracelet. It just says M468, and somebody made it for me. I don't even know who it was. It wasn't even somebody who goes Mosaic, right? That's what's crazy, because in our first 12 months in Hollywood, we had 468 people declare Christ publicly and be baptized. And so somebody made that for us, because I wear this all the time just to remind myself, you know, like, this is like what we celebrate, is the people who have publicly declared Jesus as Lord, and have been baptized at Mosaic. And I just hope that no matter what else we're known for, we're just known as a place that reaches people that would have no place to go if we did not exist. I know it's a break.
Hey, let's thank these guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
There's a place in Los Angeles called 21 Choices. It's a lot like Cold Stone Creamery or Amy's Ice Cream. They mix it up and to give it to you. And I was there. It was several years ago. My kids were little at the time. And they mix it up and they let you sample it. And if you don't like it, they'll remake it. And they mixed it up, and the woman lifts her hand over the counter to hand me the spoon, but I'm not thinking things clearly. So I get up on my tippy toes and I take a bite. It was incredibly humiliating to let a 20-year-old behind the counter feed me. And my wife was embarrassed, turned a deep shade of red. My son pushed his sister in the stroller away from us. And I let a stranger feed me. And one of the things that I've learned from these two is this idea of feeding, you know, feed me, feed me, feed me. And really what we have to do is help our people learn to feed themselves and feed others. Because if you're an adult, if you're a mature believer, you shouldn't need someone to feed you anymore. We should be making people hungry on Sundays for more of what God wants to do in their lives. So the rest of the afternoon, we have so many other great things to come. But I want to let you know about a few things. One, as I mentioned earlier, we want to hear your stories. A brand new website launched today. It's really representative of this tribe, asyouare.org. ASUR.org. This is communities that want to create a space where people can come as you are, but not stay as you are. And so we want to hear your stories. During lunch, you can record yourself and upload it on there. If you have stories like Orhan we saw earlier, and you wouldn't mind sharing that with us, we want you to help resource other churches that are creating these safe places, that are a voice for people who don't have a voice. So whether it's writing, whether it's uploading videos and stories, would you be part of that and help us, help others in this process? Also, we want to let you know of a great opportunity. Here in Austin, we just went through something in the fall called Explore God. You may have heard of it. It was amazing. We had 377 churches team together, and through this incredible group, E3, they helped really kind of bring us together. They advertised Explore God. You can go to exploregod.com, and there's all sorts of amazing videos and questions. And what happened is it was pointing people to these 377 churches. It raised the spiritual conversation in our city. And so they are here today. I would love for you to meet some of their team. In fact, if you're part of the E3 team, would you mind standing up? I know there's a booth out there. I'm putting you on the spot. Just stand up. Look for Ken. Look for the others that are outside getting ready for lunch. But we want to show you a video of how they can be part of what you're doing in your city. So let's watch.
Why were we put here? I think everyone wants to know, why were we put here? Why are we on Earth?
Let me put it this way. I like to think that God is real.
The sun makes its course.
I believe it's random. I don't think there's a plan.
For all we know, it could be aliens out there. I have no idea, to be honest.
There's so many things where it's just like that has to have something behind it.
I would say that God put this curiosity in all of our hearts. I don't think it's a bad thing that we look at other options and look down other roads to try to figure out exactly why we're here or what our purpose is in life.
I can see far from here.
So during lunch, go right outside, right near the Bethel Seminary booth. There's another booth, the Explore God booth. Find out how you can bring this incredible opportunity to your city. So how many of you are hungry for food? Time to feed yourself. And what we want to do is invite you to take advantage of lunch. When you go outside, you'll go to the left in the Kids Quest area. There's lunch. There's spaces for you to connect with people who are in the same stage of life. Find out their story. Share yours. There's also, for those of you who are married to a pastor or your church planter's wife, Kathy Burke will be in there and would love to share a lunch with you. So take advantage of these moments during lunch to get to know other people, enjoy some food, and we'll be back in here at 12:45. 12:45, yeah. You know what? When you go in, it should be self-explanatory. There's some signs and things like that when you go in. So right outside, over to Kids Quest area, and we'll see you in an hour. Thanks. God bless.